So going into these measures, first one, isolated intersection analysis. So what it is, and you guys have this as a part of your system, so I don't need to go into a lot of detail, but when we think about it, it's measuring the average peak hour delay for vehicles at an intersection. Many communities around the state use it. We just put a few examples here. Sammamish measures PM peak hour intersection delay. Something that staff asked is, do we have some examples of communities that use AM peak hour intersection delay as well? There are a number throughout the country. I didn't kind of do a full survey, but I'll say locally, we know that the city of Snoqualmie looks at both AM and PM peak hour intersection delay. So often this is based on the Highway Capacity Manual being most up to date. Highway Capacity Manual 2010 edition would be used. And the LOS is really based on how long a vehicle is waiting at the intersection. And the Highway Capacity Manual prescribes level of service grades to different vehicle delay thresholds. The way that it's then operationalized in the system is that the city's transportation element that would then say, okay, our goal is to provide level of service D or level of service E operations at certain types of intersections. And so it provides a very black and white, clear-cut measure for evaluating whether an intersection is meeting the delay standard or not. So as I promised with each of these, we're going to look into what it measures and what it doesn't measure. From the perspective of what it measures, average peak hour delay for automobiles at the intersection during the peak hour of measurement. So if you're measuring PM peak hour conditions from 5 to 6 p.m., it's not looking at kind of delay that's being experienced during any of the other 23 hours of the day. It's also not looking at what the experience is for drivers not at that intersection, nor for other modes of travel. In terms of outcomes that this type of measure would result in, it prioritizes treatments that improve intersection capacity for automobiles. Signal retiming, adding of turn lanes are some examples. Again, it focuses on improvements that alleviate congestion during the hour of measurement. So if you have a PM peak hour, or if you have an AM peak hour, commute hour condition, it's not necessarily being measured if you're looking just at the PM peak hour. It also does not tend to lead to complete street type improvements. So to the extent that it's really optimizing improvements towards the vehicle, it may not have beneficial impacts on walking and biking if it's widening intersections. Thinking about Sammamish, you guys currently measure the PM peak hour delay. It would be, from a policy perspective, a fairly modest shift to focus on and also including AM peak hour conditions. The one comment is that your travel model currently focuses on the PM peak hour, so it would require time and resources to build that AM peak hour condition and to make sure that you're collecting counts on a regular basis during the AM peak hour. But that's really the only shift that would be required.
Can we go with questions?
Yes,
okay.
please.
So I apologize. I have a lot of thoughts here. No way to keep it concise. So the first question I have is relative to option 2, which is using the intersections for a level of service. And the question I asked this morning, and hopefully you guys got the question passed to you, was how do we define the delay at an intersection? Because as I go driving through the city, you could be the first person that gets to the light as it turns yellow and then it turns red. You have to sit there and you wait. That seems obvious as to your delay at an intersection. What's maybe not so obvious is every morning when I drive Sahali and I turn the corner at 37th and I start heading down the hill, is that I immediately have to come to a stop and then a go, and a stop and a go, and a stop and a go. And my delay, I consider myself in the queue for the light all the way at the bottom of the hill, which takes me about 4 minutes and 15 seconds to get to. So at what point do we currently define when you are being counted towards that delay at an intersection?
So if I can add in here, Victor's talked about another approach that you can use, microsimulation, which is much more expensive, but can do a really good job of looking at the kind of interplay of nearby intersections, of driveways, of turning movements. That's one thing. I mean, in terms of your synchro system right now, one thing that we could look at is just extending how far each of the isolated intersections measure the delay. Something that I haven't looked at is, because we have DEA leading this work, is for the intersections, it depends on how long they've allowed that queue to be measured. To the extent for your commute that you talked about, there's a very long queue length that you're waiting in. So that is actually potentially a very simple fix the city could look to do, is to extend kind of the length of measurement for those queues for isolated intersections. It would potentially show higher overall delays, could potentially show more existing deficiencies, but to Councilmember Odell's comment, potentially it's a bit more accurate.
Yeah, and I think that's where I'm going, is that if we're not capturing the real queue, then we're doing a disservice to our residents by not really counting what's there. Deputy Mayor Hornish?
So I'm still fuzzy as to how we actually calculate the intersection delay based on traffic counts. Do we use the traffic counts to calculate the intersection delay?
Yes.
Right.
How?
How do you mean? We use...
Because if you're just counting a car that goes over a spot on the road, you have to then measure it again when it turns or goes straight to know how much it delayed at that intersection.
So to answer your question, yes, there's the way that we use it is a software called Synchro. And so that software, what it does is, first of all, we go into the software, and actually I feel like here's an image. I'm just going back to this slide. That's actually a screenshot from Synchro, and there's a lot more detailed sheets behind there that you can get into. But what Synchro does is it takes first the person that's programming it and building your Synchro network. First you try to replicate real world conditions. So turn pocket, the number of lanes on a roadway, the number of turn pockets, the length of those turn pockets. We also go into the traffic control parameters. So if there's for example, traffic signal, we'll get the signal timing plans from the city and make sure that that signal is reflecting what real world conditions are. But what then the software does is we also program in the traffic volumes, and we can program them in by 15-minute or by hour, and sometimes apply that peak hour factor that Andrew related to. We'll also put in the volumes of pedestrians and cyclists, and make sure that we get in even those walking intervals in the software. And what it does is it actually calculates for all the vehicles that are in there, it actually calculates the average amount of time that they're waiting. Doing that by hand, as you can imagine, if you were to think about it, a signal, you could certainly go out and watch a vehicle go through and measure how long it's taking them. But to do that for enough vehicles, to do it in a statistically valid format, is data prohibitive. So that's why the profession tends to use these computer softwares.
But if you're never measuring the time that first car that went through the intersection, how long it waited there, I don't know how you ever actually build a model that can estimate that.
We do go out in the field and we do calibrations, so we
talked
confirm.
about that before, but it's like, and that's get into the whole queue, and I don't want to rehash what we've talked about in the past, but I'm still really struggled with, if you never measure a car from stopped and to when it starts and its delay, all you're doing is based on counts. I can't see how you can mathematically get there if they're stopped.
One of the principles, or some of the brains inside this Synchro, are highway capacity manual, delay, and queuing methodologies.
So it's theoretical.
It's a
Based
deterministic
on no downstream restriction.
It's based on a body of data, nationally published data. And so it's not based on local data. And so that distinction brings up a discussion about a more microscopic level simulation.
Well, and I appreciate that, but I'm the one that has read the highway capacity manual, and it says assuming there's no downstream restriction. So we're basing an intersection delay on an assumed model, and we don't know if they're really stopped or not because we're doing it with software. So I'm still really struggling with this.
Well, I think that's the wisdom of the council has been to use then to supplement this data with INREX data or other software that's based on what's going on in the
Right, but
field.
if we're going to build a whole concurrency around an intersection that I think is dubious, I'm trying to rethink this. I'm almost starting to rethink this because now that I understand that it's all based on software calculations, based on assumptions at an intersection, based on traffic count, I don't know if that's measuring the user experience, which is what we were really trying to get to.
And if I may, I want to make sure I'm understanding the concern. When I build, and it's been a few years since I've built some synchro models, but when I would go about that effort, one of the things are you don't build synchro models in cities you're not going to, and you're not observing field conditions. So yes, we're not going out and observing field conditions at every of your 44 intersections and every approach. But I would go out to the primary intersections where we have questions about their operations, and I'd go out there and observe. And I'd say, is this looking like my synchro model? I can watch from the back of the queue and see how long it's taking a vehicle to progress, how many cycle failures we're having, and making sure that the results that we're getting out of our synchro model are reflecting real-world conditions. So if your concern is, have we put enough time in the field to ensure that the results we're getting out of this computer simulation are valid, I think that's a very good question, and I think that's time that the consultant team could put into doing that to the extent that it hasn't already happened. And I'll let others speak to that. However, in terms of, is this state of the practice, is this what other communities are doing? The answer is absolutely yes.
But there's implicit assumptions in that modeling, right? And I think one of those implicit modelings is, hey, as soon as it turns green, you can go. And that's what we're not having here in many cases.
And I would say, actually, the synchro will recognize when there are what we call cycle failures, which I think is the situation that you're observing. So no, it doesn't assume that you can go. It actually does recognize vehicles queuing up and how long it's taking them to get to the intersection.
How do you calibrate that if you go out? When you go out and calibrate, how many days do you watch? I mean, if you go out one day and you go, hey, it seems to be working, and tomorrow it fails, you don't see that, right?
I think one of the most important things that could come from this discussion is exactly what you bring up, which is this local sort of intuition. And when you see in a couple slides, we'll show the intersections that the model is showing are failing, sort of the problem zones. The really valuable piece that I would like to open it up to the council's input, especially on, is does this list of red areas, this list of problem zones, sort of intuitively jive with what you are getting in your experience?
Well, and that's what you can kind of correlate with INREX data too, I would assume, right?
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that the INREX data is the new big data thing that we can build into this process. But also an important part of that is local experience, which is where we submit to you guys.
Second piece was that the council generally favored an intersection-only concurrency policy. And I know that while there is discussion about moving into the future, at some future date, incorporating travel time or some of those other more innovative metrics, I think in the interest of time, the previous council kind of favored, let's go with an intersection-based concurrency policy and do away with the segment-level measures. While that's a fairly simplistic approach, it's very consistent with what a lot of other cities do. And intersection-based policy really does focus on the driver experience.
So one thing is, the congestion itself is not really being measured today, right? We don't really have people on the ground saying, okay, this is how many cars are getting through, or this is how long the queue is, like on Sahali, for example.
So on the congestion itself is not directly measured because it's a time-based, distance-based, volume-based, which we can't have enough people out there with their stopwatches, but then again, that incorporates more human error.
Yeah.
What you presented to council on those one-on-ones, or what staff presented, and then what is in our deck here, which is the two limitations of synchro, which is giving us our what's going on right now. And so I'm going to read them because they were up there before, but can't predict operational impacts at an intersection if delays are caused by a downstream choke point. Does not know how to handle standstill traffic conditions, so it assumes it doesn't occur. But it does occur. It
Absolutely.
does. And so how are we making up for the fact that
Perfect.
we actually do have standstill traffic in Sammamish?
Absolutely. I think everyone in this room would absolutely concur with that. And while these guys might not have been standing there, let me just say, I often come to Sammamish for 9 a.m. meetings, and I'm coming up from 202 and up. So I have observed those queues, and so I'm painfully aware of what folks are dealing with every day. And I say, thank goodness I'm coming into Sammamish and not leaving. What I would say is that there's a lot of weight hanging on this concurrency policy right now, and a lot more weight than one concurrency policy can bear. The TMP, I strongly think that yes, standing queues are a huge issue here. We need to model them. We need to understand them. Now, is that something that is appropriate to put in place for something that's going to be done routinely for development review? That's not typically where it's done. Where it's typically done is through the process of a transportation master plan. That's when the city puts a lot of money, a lot of investment into looking out into the future, thinking about, okay, well, how are we growing over time? How are we growing by 2024? But how are we growing as town center fully builds to its potential? Maybe as some of these other, development scenarios might occur. What happens if the state forces us to up our zoning? All of those things need to be assessed, and I would say Sammamish has a number of seriously congested corridors. 228 Sahali Way is one of them. Issaquah Pine Lake Road is one of them. Issaquah Fall City Road. There's a number. I could keep going. 244th is another one. These are ones where, as a part of the TMP, we are going to want to look at it from a variety of ways, but probably do some simulation modeling. That's the only sort of assessment that can really properly address what are these queuing issues, and then to really come up with what are those needed solutions and how do we program them into our project. So, what I'd say is I'm absolutely with you, but just in terms of the narrow lens of concurrency really isn't the place to address that. That's really a part of your city planning, and what concurrency is really supposed to do is to say, as a part of your plan, you said this is how you're going to operate, and these are the projects you need. As we're growing, are we building these projects? And I think what we're doing right now is, the concurrency is just measuring that pace, but we don't know exactly what that pace is being measured against because we don't yet have our long-term vision.
So I hear what you're saying, but I'm still struggling with that queue, even if we can address it in the TMP, because we are adopting what you're telling us is actually transpiring on the roads right now in the transportation element of the comp plan, and you're telling me there's a 12-second delay at 37th and Sahali.
Well, and that's where I think that...
To 8, but not at 8:45 when we have the peak spreading happening.
And what I would say is that, for that sort of situation, maybe that's, that other solution that staff had produced earlier this year, which was looking at, segment. So I talked with some of the experts in our office. I've talked to poor Josh about this. Really, probably at this point, isolated intersection analysis isn't really able to address that issue.
But how do we, as elected officials, go into a meeting with constituents and say, we're 97%, we're getting traffic counts, we got this information, it's been verified, but that backup, the delay, how do we convey that information without the process, if we're, at some point, if we are, we're not, going to build long-term time of travel, driver experience, whatever that winds up looking like, how do we convey that information to people when their experience, it differs day to day? I can speak to that from my own experience. It does differ day to day. But how can you put that information, or can you, based upon what we're looking at?
So how I would phrase that is you're looking long term. You're trying to figure out how are we going to build our city out so that our citizens have a reliable origin and destination trip. What we are talking about today is concurrency analysis. So that isn't necessarily, in my opinion, the place to be looking at that long-term origin and destination type of conversation. To me, it's your concurrency analysis should identify intersections or segments or whatever you deem necessary that should receive funding for mitigation in the future. The highway capacity manual software does exactly that. The synchro analysis identifies intersections where the counts are saying that that intersection is failing. To go beyond that, you would need to go to something more like a simulation model. A simulation model, there's a companion program that runs with Synchro. It's called SimTraffic. You hit the go button and it shows little, they look like jelly beans, but they're cars. And it simulates every single vehicle that you're expecting through your network. You can get origin and destination type of travel times from that. But the amount of information and data that has to go into that model makes it more difficult to use on a concurrency analysis. There are yellow reaction times for deceleration. There are startup green reaction times, vehicle acceleration rates, perception reaction times. There are probably 40 or 50 different metrics that we would have to analyze within the city and get into the model and make sure that we're modeling them correctly. That, I would say, is more on the TMP side. That's where you can dive into that type of information. Does that get to your question?
It does, and I really appreciate that
Perfect.
very much.